The judgment that shattered a world. The velvet-lined interior of La Vigna, one of the most exclusive fine dining establishments in downtown Atlanta, glowed warmly in the evening light. Its ambience was perfectly curated, a blend of muted golden chandeliers, faint jazz humming from hidden speakers, and the low murmur of wealth discussing wealth. The air was thick with the scent of aged wine, truffle oil, and the unspoken power of men and women who were used to being served, not questioned. Kyle Whitman had worked at La Vigna for nearly 2 years, and in that time, he'd mastered the art of reading guests the moment they stepped through the arched double doors. Some wore their wealth like armor, Rolex cuffs peeking from under tailored sleeves, Louboutins clicking against marble floors. Others carried it with subtlety, confidence in their stride, ease in the way they ordered $400 bottles of wine without glancing at the price. Kyle considered himself good at this, categorizing, ranking, and determining who mattered and who didn't within seconds. It was a survival skill, or so he told himself. After all, tips in places like La Vigna were directly tied to the unspoken hierarchy. The wealthy guests expected their superiority recognized and rewarded those who knew how to flatter them. The others, the regulars who somehow slipped through the reservations process, they were just noise, background diners occupying space between the truly important tables. It was a particularly busy Saturday evening when Marcus Preston first stepped into Kyle's orbit. The restaurant was at full capacity, every table glimmering with crystal, silverware polished to perfection, and servers moving like dancers through a tightly choreographed ballet of service. Marcus, however, was an anomaly. He arrived with a group, 4 men and 2 women, all dressed sharply but without the garish excess Kyle associated with wealth. No flashy designer logos, no loud watches or glittering jewelry that announced, "Look at me." The women carried understated leather bags, and the men's suits were clean and fitted, but without the unnecessary embellishments of those desperate to prove they belonged. But it was Marcus himself who caught Kyle's attention for all the wrong reasons. Marcus Preston, a black man in his late 40s, sat comfortably at the corner of the table. His blazer was a deep charcoal, tailored just enough to hint at its quality without screaming designer, paired with a crisp white shirt and no tie. His posture was relaxed, his laugh easy, but something about him didn't sit right with Kyle. He doesn't belong here. The thought was reflexive, almost unconscious. There was nothing overtly wrong with Marcus, but Kyle's assumptions operated on autopilot. In Kyle's mind, real wealth announced itself. It didn't just stroll in quietly and occupy space like it belonged. There was no gleaming watch, no impossible-to-ignore brand, nothing that marked Marcus as someone worth catering to. Kyle approached the table with his usual rehearsed smile, one that was just professional enough to pass, but never quite reached his eyes. "Good evening, gentlemen, ladies. Welcome to La Vigna. My name's Kyle, and I'll be taking care of you tonight." The introductions were routine, but Kyle's eyes kept flicking back to Marcus, mentally trying to slot him into some familiar box. Executive assistant. No, too confident. Mid-level manager tagging along with the real power players. Maybe. Kyle didn't know. More importantly, he didn't care. In his mind, Marcus was safe, the kind of guest you could afford to be a little looser with, the kind who might even appreciate a bit of playful ribbing to break the ice. After all, the real money at the table surely belonged to the white man in the navy suit at the head. "May I recommend the Wagyu steak tonight?" Kyle offered, his tone practiced and polished. "Of course, for those of you looking for something lighter." His eyes locked briefly with Marcus. "We do have an excellent salad selection. No offense, sir, but you look more like a salad guy." The words left his mouth before his brain fully processed them. A half-smirk curled at his lips, an attempt at humor designed to establish himself as the charming, witty server who could banter with the big guys. A few polite chuckles floated around the table, more out of discomfort than genuine amusement. But Marcus himself didn't laugh. He didn't frown, either. He simply looked at Kyle, his expression perfectly neutral, his gaze calm, but watchful. Kyle missed the shift in the atmosphere. He had already mentally moved on, pleased with himself for breaking the ice. In his mind, Marcus had been safely categorized as ordinary, and ordinary guests were fair game for light teasing. Kyle believed he had read the room. He hadn't. The rest of the evening progressed in a blur of orders, wine pairings, and carefully choreographed service. Kyle barely registered Marcus, treating him with the same casual indifference he reserved for anyone he didn't deem important. He made sure the table got everything they needed, but his attention always drifted to tables he considered more lucrative. Guests who, in his mind, deserved extra care because they broadcasted their wealth loud enough to demand it. What Kyle failed to notice were the subtle cues. How the conversation at Marcus's table shifted. How the other diners seemed increasingly deferential to the man in the corner seat. How the restaurant manager, Andrew, typically invisible on busy nights, made 3 separate trips past the table, each time with a glance at Marcus that carried the weight of recognition. The reveal came at the end of the meal. Kyle was clearing plates, already mentally tallying his expected tip, when Marcus stood up and stretched. He walked toward the host's stand, his movements unhurried but assured. Kyle barely glanced at him until he heard the host's voice, a nervous tremor undercutting the usual polished welcome. "Mr. Preston, it's such an honor to have you here again." Again. Kyle's brain stuttered. Again. This man, a salad guy, was a regular. He turned, discreetly, just in time to see Marcus hand over a sleek black credit card, the kind Kyle had only seen once before, when a Saudi prince had dined in a private room. It was the kind of card reserved for individuals whose wealth and influence existed at levels most people couldn't even comprehend. Marcus Preston. The name floated in Kyle's mind, a fragment of something half-remembered. And then it hit him. Marcus Preston, founder and CEO of Preston Dynamics, a technology conglomerate responsible for innovations Kyle used every day without thinking. His face had been in Forbes, Business Insider, and on the cover of Time. A self-made billionaire, one of the most powerful black executives in the country, a man who had built his empire from nothing, who had stood in boardrooms where people like Kyle would never even be allowed to step foot. And Kyle had called him a salad guy. The blood drained from Kyle's face so fast he felt dizzy. His stomach clenched, and his mind raced, replaying the moment over and over. The smirk, the dismissive tone, the joke made at the expense of a man who could have bought the entire restaurant without denting his net worth. Marcus didn't glance back at Kyle. He didn't need to. The weight of the moment settled squarely on Kyle's shoulders as the host handed Marcus his receipt, his voice still trembling with respect. The rest of the room had noticed. Conversations had slowed. Curious eyes flicked between Marcus and the pale-faced server frozen by the kitchen doors. There was no scene, no dramatic confrontation. Just the slow realization spreading like a stain across Kyle's mind that he had made the worst assumption of his life. He had judged a man by his appearance. And in doing so, Kyle had exposed himself, not Marcus, as small. As Marcus stepped out into the Atlanta night, the door closing softly behind him, Kyle stood motionless, his world cracked wide open by the simplest of truths. You never really know who's sitting at your table. The weight of assumptions. The door to La Vigna swung shut with a soft chime, but to Kyle Whitman, it felt like a gunshot echoing through his chest. The restaurant floor seemed to pulse beneath his feet, and the air felt too thin, as though the walls themselves were leaning in, pressing against him with invisible hands. Distantly, he could hear conversations resume. The polite hum of wealthy diners returning to their wine and foie gras, but Kyle wasn't part of that world anymore. He stood there, rooted like a tree split by lightning, his mind replaying every second of the encounter with a nauseating clarity. Marcus Preston. The name burned in his head, a brand sizzling into his ego. Kyle had heard it before, of course. It had floated through headlines, glided across business podcasts he half listened to during his morning commute. Marcus Preston wasn't just a name. He was the name, the kind of entrepreneur who'd built his fortune from grit, brilliance, and the kind of quiet resilience Kyle couldn't even fathom. And Kyle, the smug, cocky waiter with a chip on his shoulder, had smirked at him, made a cheap salad joke, and dismissed him like an afterthought. Whitman, the bark of his manager's voice, snapped him back into reality. Andrew, the restaurant manager, had materialized at his side, his normally easygoing expression replaced with a mask of tight-lipped fury. Andrew wasn't prone to dramatics, but tonight, his disappointment was practically radiating off his skin like heat from an open flame. Kyle opened his mouth, fumbling for words, but Andrew didn't give him the chance. My office. Now. The floor felt like quicksand under Kyle's shoes as he followed Andrew past the polished dining room, into the back hallway where the public elegance of La Vigna gave way to the utilitarian grit of the service areas. The harsh fluorescent light in the small office made Kyle feel even more exposed, like a bug under a magnifying glass. Andrew shut the door and leaned against the desk, arms crossed tightly across his chest. The silence hung between them, thick and uncomfortable. "Do you have any idea what you just did?" Andrew's voice was low, but the sharpness of it cut through Kyle's skin like glass. "Any idea?" Kyle swallowed, his throat painfully dry. I didn't know who he was." "That's your excuse." Andrew's eyebrows shot up, incredulous. "You think this is about knowing someone's title, their bank account?" "Kyle, this isn't just about who Marcus Preston is. It's about who you are." Kyle's stomach twisted. "It was a joke," he muttered weakly. "No." Andrew's voice was a slap across the face. "It was an assumption. You saw a black man, not wearing a $5,000 suit, sitting at a table in this restaurant, and you assumed he didn't matter. You assumed you were above him." Kyle's mouth opened and closed, no defense forming on his tongue. Because it was true. The horrifying part wasn't that Kyle had made a mistake. It was how effortlessly that assumption had slid into place, how automatic and natural it had felt. Kyle started, but the words withered in his throat. Andrew's expression softened, just slightly. "Do you know how long Marcus Preston's been dining here?" Kyle shook his head. 6 years, Andrew said. "He's been coming here whenever he's in town. Never draws attention to himself. Never demands special treatment. He could buy this restaurant if he wanted to, but he treats every server, every host, with respect." Kyle's chest felt tight. The weight of his own ignorance settled heavy on his shoulders. "I'm sorry," Kyle said, his voice barely above a whisper. Andrew sighed, the kind of tired exhale of someone who'd seen too many bright futures dimmed by arrogance. "Sorry isn't the point, Kyle. It's not about saying the right thing now. It's about why you said the wrong thing in the first place." Kyle sat there, shame soaking into his skin. Every time he dismissed a guest for not looking the part, every smirk, every joke at someone's expense, it all came back like poison bubbling up from a well he didn't even know existed inside him. Andrew's voice gentled. "You've got some thinking to do. A lot of it." Kyle nodded, numb. "Am I fired?" Andrew was quiet for a moment. "No, but you're on the thinnest ice I can give you. If you want to stay here, you're going to have to prove you can be better than this." Kyle could barely breathe from the relief and the dread that followed. Staying meant facing what he'd done, over and over, until the shame was burned into him. "Go home," Andrew said, "and figure out who you want to be." The long night. Kyle's apartment felt like a cell when he got home. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the hum of the refrigerator and the occasional horn from the street below. He paced the tiny living room, hands clenched, mind replaying the night in a relentless loop. His reflection in the window startled him, the same face he'd seen every day, but somehow different now. Smaller, meaner. He thought about Marcus Preston, not the CEO, not the billionaire, But the man who had sat there, smiling politely while Kyle reduced him to a punchline. The man who had probably faced a lifetime of being underestimated, misjudged, and dismissed. And Kyle, oblivious, had added his name to that long, ugly list. He thought about all the other guests he'd silently ranked and dismissed. The quiet older woman who ordered the cheapest wine. The young couple who shared an entree. How many times had he made them feel small? How many times had his assumptions stolen their dignity? The realization burned like acid in his gut. At some point, Kyle sank onto the couch, the weight of it all crashing down until his face was in his hands and his shoulders shook. Shame wasn't a loud emotion. It was a quiet, suffocating thing, curling inside his chest and whispering truths he'd spent years avoiding. You're not better than anyone. You've been the villain in someone's story. You thought the suit made the man. But the man makes the man. Kyle didn't sleep that night. Instead, he sat there, eyes wide open, staring at the ceiling as dawn crept through his windows. And when the sun finally rose, it illuminated something rare in Kyle Whitman's heart. Humility. The first step. The next day at work, Kyle felt like a ghost haunting his own life. The staff knew. The kitchen staff, the hosts, the other servers, they all knew what had happened. Some avoided his eyes, others stared too long, and all of them whispered when they thought he couldn't hear. But Kyle didn't get defensive. Not this time. He started small. He said good morning to the dishwasher, a man he'd never exchanged more than a grunt with before. He cleared plates for another server without being asked, and when a family sat down, a father in work boots and a mother in a department store dress, Kyle served them with the same care he used for the city's elite. It wasn't penance. It was practice. And when Marcus Preston's reservation appeared on the books for the following week, Kyle's hand shook. Because redemption wasn't earned with one apology. It was built, brick by brick, on the foundation of humility and the willingness to truly see the people you once overlooked. The choice to change. The sun had barely dipped behind the Atlanta skyline when Kyle stepped through the doors of La Vigna the following Friday night. His stomach clenched so tight it felt like a fist had lodged itself beneath his ribs. He'd spent the past week in a haze of discomfort, haunted by memories of his arrogance and assumptions, each replay more excruciating than the last. Tonight was different. Marcus Preston's name was on the reservation list. Kyle knew it the second he checked the evening seating chart. Table 17. Corner booth. Marcus's usual spot. He wasn't dining with his colleagues this time, just a reservation for one. Kyle's first reaction was panic. Avoid the table. Let someone else take it. Maybe hide in the kitchen until Marcus left. But shame has a way of leaving nowhere to hide. This wasn't something Kyle could sidestep. His entire sense of self was tangled up in what he'd said, the assumptions he'd made, and the man he'd revealed himself to be. Avoiding Marcus meant avoiding the truth about himself, and Kyle had spent enough time running from that. If he was serious about changing, it had to start now. Face the man. First contact. The first time Kyle saw Marcus that night, the air seemed to thin around him. Marcus arrived alone, dressed in the same unassuming elegance that had fooled Kyle once before. A dark suit, well-fitted but quiet. There was no entourage, no flash. Marcus Preston had no need to announce himself. He existed in his own gravity. Kyle approached the table with his hands clasped behind his back to hide the sweat on his palms. "Good evening, sir," Kyle said, his voice controlled, but inside, his heart was a thunderstorm. Marcus looked up, and for a moment, Kyle felt like a child standing before a principal, waiting for the sentence to drop. But there was no anger in Marcus's face. Just calm observation. A man who had seen everything and knew when someone stood on the edge of their own reckoning. "Good evening," Marcus replied, his voice smooth, even. Kyle cleared his throat. "Mr. Preston, before I take your order, His throat closed up for a second. He forced himself to continue. I wanted to apologize for the way I treated you last time you were here. Marcus didn't speak, didn't interrupt. He just folded his hands together on the table and listened. That silence was heavier than any scolding Kyle could have received. Kyle swallowed hard. I made assumptions about you based on nothing but your appearance. It was wrong. It was ignorant. And I'm sorry. The moment hung there between them, fragile as glass. Finally, Marcus spoke. Thank you for saying that. Kyle exhaled, though it didn't feel like relief. I know an apology isn't enough, but I spent the past week thinking about why I did it, and the truth is, he hesitated, but the only way out was through. It's not the first time I've judged someone like that. There it was, the ugliest truth laid bare. I've spent my whole life thinking I could read people by what they wore, how they carried themselves, how much they seemed to belong. And it took humiliating myself in front of you to realize how small that makes me. The words were raw, unpolished, but they were real. For the first time, Kyle wasn't performing for approval. He was exposing the soft, ugly core of himself, and it terrified him. Marcus's expression didn't shift, but there was a glimmer of something, maybe curiosity, maybe something softer, in his eyes. Sit down, Marcus said quietly, gesturing to the empty seat across from him. Kyle froze, uncertain. Sir, I'm working, I shouldn't. You want to change? Marcus asked. Kyle nodded. Then sit. Kyle slid into the booth, heart pounding. The restaurant buzzed around them, but the world shrank to this small, candlelit table and the man across from him. Tell me something, Marcus said, folding his hands. Where did you learn to judge people like that? Kyle blinked. What do you mean? I mean, Marcus said, you weren't born thinking a man in an understated suit was worth less respect than a man with a Rolex. Someone taught you to see the world that way. Kyle stared at his hands. I don't know. It just happened. Nothing just happens, Marcus said. It's built, piece by piece. Kyle's mind drifted back, unspooling memories he hadn't touched in years. His parents, working class, proud of their sacrifices, always emphasizing how the rich lived in a different world. His first job bussing tables at a mid-tier steakhouse, where the biggest tips always came from men in flashy watches and women dripping in designer labels. His coworkers joking that you could spot a bad tipper just by their shoes. All those tiny lessons, layering themselves into a worldview where wealth meant importance, where appearance dictated value. I guess I built it myself, Kyle admitted softly. Brick by brick. Marcus nodded slowly. Then you can tear it down. Brick by brick. The weight of perspective. They spoke for nearly half an hour. Kyle's manager, Andrew, must have noticed because no one interrupted them. Marcus didn't lecture. He didn't scold. He asked questions, questions that forced Kyle to look at himself from angles he'd avoided his whole life. Who are you when no one's watching? How do you decide who matters? What makes you worthy of respect? And with each question, Kyle's carefully constructed identity, one that prized charm over substance, surface over depth, crumbled a little more. You know, Marcus said at one point, you're not the first person to make assumptions about me. Kyle's stomach knotted in shame. And you won't be the last, Marcus continued. But you might be one of the few who admits it. Kyle couldn't tell if that was a compliment or a condemnation. Maybe it was both. When the conversation ended, Kyle stood, legs shaky, but lighter somehow. I hope you'll let me serve you tonight, Kyle said. Marcus smiled faintly. I'd like that. The long road back. That evening, Kyle served Marcus with a level of care he'd never shown anyone before, not out of fear, but out of genuine respect. He asked questions about Marcus's meal preferences, recommended pairings based on the conversation they'd had, and even caught himself smiling, not the plastic smile he usually wore, but something real. And when Marcus left, Kyle didn't expect a handshake or a grand gesture. Just a simple nod from the man who'd forced him to see himself with clearer eyes. But Marcus left something more valuable behind. A shift. Not just in how Kyle treated him, but in how Kyle saw everyone. Over the following weeks, Kyle found himself hesitating before making the silent judgments that used to come so easily. He started asking questions, small ones, simple ones, to guests he once would have ignored. He started learning names. He started listening. And slowly, brick by brick, the wall of arrogance he built over years began to come down. Not perfectly, not all at once. Some days, he slipped back into old habits, catching himself halfway through a dismissive thought. But now, there was a voice in his head, sometimes sounding like Marcus, sometimes like his own conscience, reminding him that everyone is a story you haven't read yet. Epilogue. The Man in the Mirror. Months later, Kyle stood in front of the mirror in his tiny apartment, adjusting his tie before another shift. His reflection stared back at him, familiar yet different. The face was the same, but the eyes saw more. When he walked into La Vigna that evening, the restaurant was no different than the one where he'd once made the worst mistake of his life. But Kyle was different. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough.